At 53, I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I thought 30 years of marriage had shown me every possible disappointment. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered in my husband's laptop that Tuesday morning while he was in the shower. Credit card statements for a luxury apartment I'd never seen, jewelry purchases I'd never received, weekend trips to places we'd never been together. And then I saw her name, Rebecca Chen, 28 years old, his marketing consultant who'd been billing us for services I was certain had nothing to do with business. That's when I realized my entire life had been a carefully constructed lie, and I had exactly one choice left: walk away with my dignity intact, or stay and watch 30 years of my life crumble into nothing. So I did something that shocked everyone, including myself. I sold everything we owned, took every penny from our accounts, and left him a note that would change both our lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Walsh, and I spent 3 decades believing I was living the perfect suburban dream. Our house in Millbrook Heights had the white picket fence, the manicured lawn, the 2-car garage where David's BMW sat next to my sensible Honda. I was the wife who had dinner ready at 6, who attended every company party with a smile, who never questioned why David worked late 3 nights a week, or why his business trips seemed to increase every year. I met David when I was 23, fresh out of college with a degree in graphic design and dreams of starting my own creative agency. He was 31, already climbing the corporate ladder at Henderson Marketing, charming and confident in a way that made me feel special for capturing his attention. Our courtship was a whirlwind of expensive dinners and weekend getaways, and when he proposed after 8 months, I said yes without hesitation. The early years were good. We bought our first house, a small starter home in Riverside, and I freelanced from our converted spare bedroom while David established himself as one of Henderson's top account managers. We talked about children, about growing the business, about the life we'd build together. But somehow, those conversations always ended with David suggesting we wait just a little longer. Wait until his next promotion. Wait until we could afford the bigger house. Wait until the timing was perfect. By the time I turned 30, the waiting had become a pattern. David's career flourished while mine remained safely contained to small local clients and part-time projects. When I suggested expanding my business or taking on larger contracts, David would smile and remind me how much he needed my support at home. How important it was for one of us to be available for the networking events and client dinners that were so crucial to his success. "Catherine, you're so much better at this domestic stuff than I am," he'd say, wrapping his arms around me in the kitchen. "I couldn't do what I do without knowing you're here, keeping everything running smoothly." So I kept everything running smoothly. I organized his schedule, managed our social calendar, and made sure our home was always ready to entertain his colleagues and clients. When we moved to the house in Millbrook Heights, a sprawling colonial with 4 bedrooms and a gourmet kitchen, I convinced myself that this was what success looked like. This was what I'd worked for. The children never came. Not because we couldn't have them, but because David always had another reason to postpone. First, it was the new position that required more travel. Then it was the market volatility that made it financially irresponsible. By the time I hit 40, he'd stopped pretending we were just waiting for the right time, and started talking about how much freedom we had without kids, how much we could travel and enjoy our lives. I threw myself into volunteer work instead. I redesigned the website for the local animal shelter, created marketing materials for 3 different charities, and organized fundraising events that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for causes I cared about. David would attend these events with me, playing the role of the supportive husband, charming everyone with his stories about my little projects. That should have been my first real warning sign. The way he diminished everything I accomplished, turning my professional skills into cute hobbies, and my meaningful work into amusing pastimes. But I was so grateful for his presence, so afraid of rocking the boat of our seemingly perfect life, that I chose to see it as affection rather than condescension. The second warning sign was harder to ignore. 3 years ago, David started working with new clients, younger entrepreneurs, who needed what he called intensive consulting. He'd come home energized from these meetings, talking excitedly about innovative marketing strategies and fresh approaches to brand development. For the first time in years, he seemed truly passionate about his work. These young companies, Catherine, they're not bogged down by traditional thinking, he'd say over dinner. They're willing to take risks, to try new things. It's refreshing to work with people who aren't afraid to disrupt the status quo. I was happy for him. After watching his enthusiasm for work gradually diminish over the years, it was wonderful to see him excited again. I encouraged him to take on more of these challenging projects, even when it meant longer hours and more frequent travel. I wanted him to be fulfilled, to find the same sense of purpose in his career that I was finding in my volunteer work. The irony wasn't lost on me later. While I was encouraging my husband to spend more time with young, innovative entrepreneurs, I was actually enabling him to spend more time with the young, innovative woman who would eventually steal everything I thought was mine. Rebecca Chen came into our lives as a name on David's calendar. Marketing consultation with Chen appeared on his schedule 3 times a week, always during hours when I assumed he was meeting with other clients. When I asked about this new client during one of our increasingly rare dinner conversations, David was enthusiastic in his praise. "Rebecca's brilliant," he said, cutting into his steak with more energy than he'd shown for anything in months. "She's developing this incredible app that's going to revolutionize how small businesses handle their social media presence. The potential is enormous." I smiled and nodded, pleased to see him so engaged. "What kind of marketing strategy are you developing for her?" "It's complicated," he said, waving his fork dismissively. "Lots of technical aspects you probably wouldn't find interesting. But the consulting fees are substantial, which is great for us." Another warning sign I chose to ignore. David had never been secretive about his work before. He'd always been eager to explain his strategies, to bounce ideas off me, to get my perspective on design elements or campaign concepts. This sudden reluctance to share details should have raised red flags, but I was so accustomed to being excluded from the important aspects of his professional life that it felt normal. The changes in David's behavior were gradual enough that I didn't notice them at first. He started working out again, something he hadn't done consistently since our early 30s. He updated his wardrobe, trading his conservative suits for more modern cuts and brighter colors. He began paying attention to skincare routines and hair products, asking me for advice about anti-aging treatments. "I want to make sure I'm presenting the best possible image to these younger clients," he explained when I complimented his new appearance. "First impressions matter so much in this business." I was proud of him for taking better care of himself. I encouraged the gym membership, helped him shop for clothes, and even researched dermatologists when he expressed interest in professional skincare treatments. I thought I was being a supportive wife, helping my husband maintain his competitive edge in a youth.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Oriented industry. Looking back, I realize I was helping him prepare for his affair. The business trips increased dramatically. What had once been monthly overnight trips became weekly excursions, often lasting 3 or 4 days. David would pack his new clothes, his grooming products, and his laptop, kissing me goodbye with the same affectionate routine we'd maintained for years. "I'll miss you," he'd say, holding me close by the front door. "But this client work is really paying off. We're going to be able to renovate the kitchen sooner than we thought." I loved those moments. They felt like proof that despite the changes in our routine, despite the longer hours and increased travel, our marriage was still solid. David still loved me, still wanted to build a future with me, still saw me as his partner in creating the life we'd always planned. The kitchen renovation became our shared obsession. We spent evenings browsing design websites, visiting showrooms, and planning the perfect space for entertaining. David was particularly interested in high-end appliances and luxury finishes, pushing for upgrades that seemed extravagant even with his increased income. "We should do this right," he'd say, scrolling through photos of marble countertops and custom cabinetry. "We've waited long enough to have the home we really want." I agreed wholeheartedly. After years of careful budgeting and modest living, it felt wonderful to plan something truly beautiful for our home. I researched contractors, collected quotes, and created detailed spreadsheets comparing options and costs. This project became my focus, my excitement, my proof that our marriage was entering a new and prosperous phase. What I didn't know was that David was planning a different kind of renovation entirely. While I was designing our dream kitchen, he was designing his exit strategy from our marriage. The first crack in my carefully maintained ignorance came 6 months ago during what should have been a routine evening. David was in the shower, and his laptop was open on the kitchen counter where he'd left it after showing me photos of a new restaurant he wanted to try. His email notifications kept chiming, and after the 5th interruption, I glanced at the screen to see if it was something urgent that needed his immediate attention. The email preview was from Chen, and the subject line made my stomach drop, "Can't wait for this weekend." I told myself it was business. Maybe they had a presentation or client meeting scheduled. Maybe she was excited about a marketing campaign they'd developed together. I closed the laptop and went back to loading the dishwasher, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, lying in bed next to David while he slept peacefully, I stared at the ceiling and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Rebecca was his client. She was probably just enthusiastic about their work together. The fact that I felt suspicious said more about my own insecurities than about David's behavior. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the following weeks I found myself paying closer attention to details I had previously overlooked. The way David's face lit up when his phone buzzed with notifications. The careful way he positioned his laptop screen so I couldn't see it when he worked at home. The new cologne he'd started wearing, something more expensive and sophisticated than anything he'd ever chosen before. "I like the new fragrance," I mentioned one morning as he prepared to leave for another business trip. "Rebecca recommended it," he said absently, then caught himself. "I mean, she mentioned that her previous marketing consultant wore something similar. Professional image, you know." The explanation was reasonable, but something about his quick correction bothered me. Why had he mentioned Rebecca's name so casually, then seemed to regret it? Why did it matter what fragrance his client's previous consultant had worn? I started noticing other small changes. David began paying more attention to his phone, responding to messages with a secretive smile I hadn't seen in years. He started taking calls in his office with the door closed, something he'd never done when conducting business from home. He became more interested in my schedule, asking detailed questions about my volunteer work and social commitments. "When's your next board meeting for the animal shelter?" he'd ask over breakfast. "Thursday evening. Why?" "Just trying to keep track of your busy schedule," he'd say with a smile. "I want to make sure I'm available when you need me." It seemed thoughtful, but gradually I realized these questions always preceded his business trips or late work sessions. He was making sure he knew when I'd be out of the house, when he could make calls or have conversations without worrying about my presence. The final warning sign came 3 months ago during a dinner party we hosted for several of David's colleagues and their wives. I'd spent days preparing, creating a menu that would showcase our dining room and demonstrate my skills as a hostess. Everything was perfect. The table setting, the wine selection, the carefully planned conversation topics that would keep everyone engaged. During the main course, Marcus Henderson, David's boss, raised his glass for a toast. "To David and Catherine," he announced, "for their incredible hospitality and for David's outstanding work with our most challenging clients." Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a flush of pride. These were the moments that made all the work worthwhile, the recognition that our partnership was successful and respected. "David's really found his niche with the younger entrepreneurs," Marcus continued. "That Chen account especially. I've never seen consulting fees like that from such a small startup." I smiled and nodded, but something about Marcus's tone bothered me. There was an undertone I couldn't identify, a subtle emphasis on certain words that suggested hidden meaning. After the guests left, I helped David clean up while my mind replayed Marcus's comments. "The Chen account must be going really well," I said casually while loading the dishwasher. "Very well," David agreed, but he didn't elaborate the way he usually did when his work was praised. Marcus seemed impressed by the consulting fees. "That's wonderful for your reputation." David paused in his wiping of the dining room table. "Marcus talks too much when he's been drinking," he said finally. "Client confidentiality is important in this business." It was the first time David had ever suggested that Marcus was indiscreet, and the first time he'd ever declined to discuss the positive aspects of his work. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air coming through our open windows. That night, I lay awake long after David fell asleep, trying to piece together a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. The increased travel, the secrecy about his work, the changes in his appearance and behavior, the careful attention to my schedule, the defensive response to Marcus's praise. Individually, each element could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture I wasn't ready to see. But the universe, it seemed, was ready to show me whether I wanted to see it or not. The revelation came on that Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 weeks after our dinner party. David was preparing for another business trip, this one to Portland, for what he described as an intensive strategy session with a new client. He'd been excited about this trip for days, talking about innovative marketing approaches and breakthrough opportunities. "This could be the account that really establishes my reputation in the industry," he'd said while packing his suitcase. The client specifically requested me based on my work with emerging businesses. I was happy for him, genuinely pleased that his career was reaching new heights. As he loaded his laptop bag and gathered his toiletries, I offered to make him breakfast before his flight. "That's sweet, but I need to shower and get moving," he said, kissing my forehead. "Traffic to the airport is going to be brutal." I watched him disappear into our master bathroom, heard the water start running, and felt that familiar mixture of pride and loneliness that accompanied his departures. I was proud of his success, but I missed the early years when business trips were rare and his absence felt significant. His laptop was sitting open on our bedroom dresser, the screen still glowing from his final email check before leaving. I wasn't planning to look. I had no intention of invading his privacy or searching for problems that might not exist. But as I walked past the dresser to make the bed, a notification popped up on the screen, and I glanced at it automatically. The email was from Chen, sent at 7:43 that morning with the subject line, "So excited for our getaway weekend." My hands started shaking before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. A getaway weekend. Not a business trip. Not a client meeting. A romantic escape with another woman. I told myself to close the laptop, to respect David's privacy, to trust the marriage we'd built over 30 years. But my finger moved on its own, clicking to open the email. "David, darling." It began, and that single word destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. I can barely concentrate on work today, knowing that in just a few hours we'll be in Portland together. The suite at the Riverside Hotel looks incredible, and I've already packed that red dress you love so much. 2 whole days with no interruptions, no hiding, just us. I know you said Catherine thinks you're meeting with clients, but I can't help feeling guilty about the deception. Are you sure this is what you want? I love you so much, and I want us to be together always, but I hate that we have to sneak around. I can't wait to hold you again. All my love, Rebecca. I read the email 3 times before the words fully penetrated. My husband of 30 years was having an affair. The business trips, the late nights, the mysterious client who paid such substantial consulting fees. It was all a lie. David wasn't building his career. He was building a relationship with another woman. The bathroom door was still closed, the shower still running. I had maybe 10 minutes before David emerged, ready to leave for his romantic weekend with Chen. 10 minutes to decide how to handle the destruction of my entire world. I could confront him immediately, demand explanations, fight for the marriage I'd invested 3 decades in building. I could pretend I hadn't seen anything, go back to my carefully maintained ignorance, and hope that this affair would burn itself out naturally. Or I could use these 10 minutes to gather information, to understand the scope of what I was dealing with before making any decisions about my future. I chose information. With trembling fingers, I began scrolling through David's email history, searching for any correspondence with Chen. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The affair wasn't a recent development or a moment of weakness. They'd been involved for over 18 months, carrying on an elaborate deception that involved fake business meetings, fabricated client consultations, and a network of lies that touched every aspect of our marriage. The emails revealed a relationship that had progressed far beyond physical attraction. David and Rebecca discussed their future together, their plans for when he would leave me, Their shared dreams of starting a business partnership that would combine his marketing expertise with her technological innovations. They'd looked at apartments together, discussed investment strategies, and planned a life that had no place for me in it. But the most devastating discovery was the financial evidence scattered throughout their correspondence. David hadn't just been lying about his business trips and work schedule. He'd been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts to fund his relationship with Rebecca. The luxury apartment I'd never seen was a love nest he'd rented for their meetings. The jewelry purchases I'd never received were gifts for her. The substantial consulting fees Marcus had mentioned were payments David was making to Rebecca's fake business to justify the money transfers. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He was stealing from me to finance it. The shower turned off, and I heard David moving around in the bathroom, probably shaving and applying the new cologne Rebecca had recommended. I quickly closed his laptop and stumbled downstairs to the kitchen, my mind reeling from what I'd discovered. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of trust, partnership, and shared dreams. 30 years of believing that David and I were building something together, that our life in Millbrook Heights represented success and security and love, all of it based on lies. I stood at the kitchen sink, gripping the counter while waves of nausea washed over me. David appeared in the doorway 5 minutes later, looking handsome and excited, ready for his romantic weekend with another woman. "I'll call you tonight," he said, kissing my cheek in the same casual way he'd done thousands of times before. "Don't wait up if it's late." These strategy sessions can go pretty long. I managed to nod and smile, managed to play the role of the supportive wife sending her husband off on another business trip. But inside, I was already planning something that would shock David, Rebecca, and everyone else who thought they knew Catherine Walsh. As soon as David's BMW disappeared down our street, I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix. Margaret was 5 years older than me, divorced for the past decade, and the strongest woman I knew. She'd rebuilt her life from scratch after discovering her husband's gambling addiction, and she'd always encouraged me to maintain my independence even within marriage. "Catherine," she answered on the second ring, "this is a nice surprise. How are you?" "I need your help," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "David's having an affair, and I'm leaving him." There was a pause, then Margaret's voice came back stronger. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, I explained what I'd discovered, reading portions of the emails aloud while Margaret listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "How long have you suspected?" she asked. "Part of me has known something was wrong for months," I admitted. But I kept making excuses, convincing myself I was being paranoid. And now? Now I know that our entire marriage has been a lie. Maybe not from the beginning, but certainly for the past 2 years. He's been planning a life with her while pretending to build a future with me. What do you want to do? The question hung in the air while I considered my options. I could stay and fight for a marriage that David had already abandoned in his heart. I could confront him when he returned from his weekend with Rebecca, demand counseling and promises and explanations that might or might not be truthful. I could try to salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship. Or I could acknowledge that the marriage I'd believed in no longer existed, if it ever had, and start building a life that was entirely my own. "I want to disappear," I said finally. "I want to take control of this situation before David has a chance to manipulate it. I want to leave on my own terms." "Good," Margaret said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. "Because you deserve so much better than this, Catherine. You always have." We spent the rest of the day planning my escape. Margaret suggested I contact a divorce attorney immediately to understand my rights and options. She recommended a financial advisor who could help me protect my assets. Most importantly, she offered me a place to stay in Phoenix while I figured out my next steps. "You can have my guest room for as long as you need," she said. "Take time to heal, to decide what you want your new life to look like." That evening, I began the process of reclaiming my independence. I opened a new bank account in my name only, transferring half of our joint savings before David could move any more money to fund his affair. I contacted 3 divorce attorneys, scheduling consultations for the following week. I researched the laws governing property division in our state, learning about my rights to our house, our investments, and David's retirement accounts. Most importantly, I began documenting everything. I printed copies of David's emails with Rebecca, photographed our financial statements, and created a detailed timeline of his deception. If David wanted to play games with our marriage, I was going to make sure I had all the cards. Saturday and Sunday passed in a blur of preparation and planning. David called each evening as promised, describing fictional client meetings and imaginary business dinners while I listened with growing disgust. His ability to lie so smoothly, so convincingly, made me wonder how many other deceptions I'd failed to notice over the years. Sunday night, after David's final call from his fake business trip, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for him to come home. I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to manipulate the situation or control the narrative. I was going to leave first, on my own terms, with my dignity intact. Monday morning, I called a real estate agent and put our house on the market. The agent was surprised by my urgency, but the Millbrook Heights market was strong, and she was confident we could find a buyer quickly if I was willing to price competitively. "Are you sure you want to move this fast?" she asked as we walked through the rooms I'd decorated with such care over the years. "This is a significant decision." "I'm sure," I said, looking around the kitchen where David and I had planned our renovation, the living room where we'd entertained his colleagues, the bedroom where I'd slept next to a stranger for months without realizing it. This house represents a life that no longer exists. It's time for something new. Tuesday morning, I began the process of liquidating everything we owned. I contacted auction houses about our furniture and artwork. I arranged for estate sale companies to handle our personal belongings. I researched moving companies that could transport my essential items to Phoenix. That afternoon, I went to our bank and closed our joint accounts, transferring my half of the money to my new personal account. The bank manager tried to discourage me, explaining that such drastic financial moves usually required both spouses' signatures. "My husband has been making unauthorized transfers from these accounts," I explained, showing her printed evidence of David's payments to Rebecca. "I'm protecting my assets from further theft." The manager's attitude changed immediately when she saw the documentation. Within an hour, I had sole control over my portion of our marital assets, and David's access to our joint funds was permanently severed. Wednesday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Our real estate agent had received 3 offers on the house, all above asking price. The Millbrook Heights market was even stronger than she'd anticipated, and buyers were eager to secure properties in our neighborhood. "I can have the paperwork ready this afternoon," she said excitedly. "We can close in 2 weeks if you're willing to accept the highest offer." "I accept," I said, without hesitation. "Draw up the contracts." By Wednesday evening, our house was sold, our assets were divided, and our belongings were scheduled for removal. David was still in Portland with Rebecca, still calling me each night with updates about his fictional business meetings, still completely unaware that his wife had dismantled their shared life in his absence. Thursday morning, I packed my personal belongings into 2 suitcases, loaded my car with the few items I wanted to keep, and walked through our house one final time. 30 years of memories surrounded me, but they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The woman who had lived in this house, who had trusted David Walsh completely, who had built her identity around being the perfect suburban wife, no longer existed. I sat down at the kitchen table, where David and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd planned our renovation, where I'd read his emails with Rebecca just 4 days earlier. I pulled out a sheet of our personalized stationery and began writing the letter that would end our marriage. "David," I wrote, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone and our life together will be officially over. I know about Rebecca. I know about the apartment, the fake consulting fees, the 18 months of lies. I know about your plans to leave me for her. Your discussions of a future that doesn't include me. I know about the money you've been stealing from our accounts to finance your affair. I know everything." I paused, considering how much more to reveal, how much detail to include about my discoveries. Then I decided that David deserved to understand exactly how thoroughly his deception had been exposed. "I've seen your emails planning romantic getaways while telling me you were meeting with clients. I've read your discussions about apartments you were considering for your new life together. I've documented every financial transaction you've made to support your relationship with her. You've been living a lie for 18 months, but I've been living the truth for the past week." I explained what I'd done while he was in Portland with Rebecca. The house sale, the asset division, the legal consultations, the complete dismantling of our shared life. I wanted him to understand that his betrayal had consequences, that his actions had cost him everything he'd taken for granted. You wanted a new life with Rebecca, I continued. Now you have it. Our house is sold, our accounts are closed, and our marriage is over. I've taken my half of everything we built together, and you're free to start fresh with the woman you've been planning a future with. Consider this my gift to both of you. I signed the letter simply Catherine and left it on the kitchen counter, where David would see it immediately upon returning home. Then I walked out of our house, locked the door for the last time, and drove away from Millbrook Heights forever. The drive to Phoenix took 2 days, with an overnight stop in a small town where nobody knew me and I could process what I'd done without interference. As I sat in an anonymous hotel room, eating takeout Chinese food and watching the local news, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete freedom. For 30 years, I'd defined myself in relation to David. I was David's wife, David's partner, David's support system. I'd shaped my dreams around his career, my social life around his colleagues, my identity around our marriage. Now, for the first time since I was 23 years old, I was simply Catherine Walsh, and I could be anyone I wanted to be. Margaret was waiting for me when I arrived at her house in Phoenix, a beautiful Southwestern-style home with a guest casita that would become my sanctuary while I rebuilt my life. She helped me unload my car, then sat with me on her patio while I told her about the events of the past week. "I'm proud of you," she said when I finished explaining how I'd handled David's betrayal. "You could have stayed and fought for scraps of a marriage that was already over. Instead, you took control and protected yourself." "I feel like I should be sadder," I admitted. 30 years of marriage, and I just walked away. Shouldn't I be more devastated? "You grieved the loss of your marriage months ago," Margaret said wisely. "You just didn't realize it at the time. All those nights lying awake, feeling disconnected from David, all those moments when you felt like something was wrong, you were already mourning what you'd lost." She was right. The woman who had loved David Walsh completely, who had trusted him with her entire future, had died gradually over the past year as the evidence of his betrayal accumulated. I hadn't killed our marriage by leaving. I'd simply acknowledged that it was already dead. That night, as I lay in Margaret's guest room, surrounded by the few possessions I'd chosen to keep from my old life, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to hear his voice one last time, needed to understand how he would react to discovering that his carefully controlled world had collapsed in his absence. "Catherine?" His voice was tight with panic. "What the hell is going on? I came home and the house is empty. There's a sold sign in the yard. Your note says, I don't understand what's happening." "You understand perfectly," I said calmly. "I found out about Rebecca. I know about everything, David. The apartment, the money, the lies. All of it." There was a long pause. When David spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming the cold, calculating tone I'd never heard him use with me before. "You can't just sell our house without my permission," he said. "You can't take our money and disappear. I'll sue you for theft." "I took exactly half of our marital assets," I replied. "Everything I did was completely legal. I consulted with 3 different attorneys to make sure of that." "This is insane, Catherine. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. What you found, it's not what you think." For just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old uncertainty, the willingness to believe David's explanations, even when they contradicted the evidence. Then I remembered Rebecca's email about the red dress David loved, the discussions of their future together, the systematic theft of our money to fund their relationship. "It's exactly what I think," I said firmly. "And there's nothing to work out. Our marriage is over, David. You ended it when you chose to build a life with someone else, while lying to me about our future together." "Where are you?" he demanded. "We need to discuss this in person." "No, we don't. My attorney will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. Any communication from now on goes through lawyers." I hung up before David could respond, then turned off my phone and sat in the darkness of my new room, feeling strangely peaceful. The confrontation I'd dreaded for days was over, and it had confirmed everything I'd suspected about the man I'd been married to. When faced with the consequences of his actions, David hadn't expressed remorse or asked for forgiveness. He'd immediately moved to threats and manipulation, trying to regain control of a situation that was no longer his to control. The David I'd loved and trusted for 30 years had probably never existed. The man I'd spoken to on the phone was the real David Walsh, the one who could lie smoothly for 18 months, steal money from his wife to fund an affair, and then blame her for protecting herself when she discovered his betrayal. I'd been married to a stranger, and now I was free. The next morning, I woke up in Phoenix sunshine, surrounded by desert mountains and infinite possibilities. Margaret had left coffee and fresh fruit on the kitchen counter, along with a note saying she'd gone to work and I should make myself at home. For the first time in decades, I had an entire day with no obligations, no schedule to maintain, no one else's needs to consider. I sat on Margaret's patio with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the Sonoran Desert, and began planning the life I wanted to build. I was 53 years old with substantial financial resources, professional skills that hadn't been fully utilized in years, and complete freedom to make choices based on my own desires rather than someone else's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely perfect. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment I thought it might be David trying a different approach. Instead, it was my attorney in Millbrook Heights, confirming that she'd received David's legal response to our divorce filing. "He's not contesting the asset division," she wrote. "Looks like he wants this resolved quickly. We should be able to finalize everything within 60 days. I smiled, understanding exactly why David was eager to end our marriage efficiently. He wanted to start his new life with Rebecca without the complication of a messy divorce, and he'd realized that fighting me would only prolong the process and potentially expose more of his deception. Fine with me. The sooner our marriage was legally dissolved, the sooner I could stop thinking of myself as David Walsh's estranged wife and start being simply Catherine, a woman with her whole future ahead of her. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Phoenix and spent hours exploring the city that would become my new home. I visited art galleries, browsed bookstores, and stopped at cafes where I could sit and watch people living their own independent lives. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about the future. By evening, I'd made several decisions that would shape my new life. I would stay in Phoenix permanently, finding my own place once the divorce was finalized. I would restart my graphic design business, focusing on clients and projects that genuinely interested me, rather than accepting whatever work fit around David's schedule. I would travel, something David had always delayed with promises of someday that never arrived. Most importantly, I would never again build my identity around someone else's life. The next relationship I entered, if there ever was one, would be a partnership between two. 3 weeks into my new life in Phoenix, I received a phone call that changed everything. I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, working on a logo design for a local nonprofit, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Catherine Walsh?" The voice was professional, crisp, belonging to someone accustomed to delivering important information. "Yes, this is Catherine. My name is Jennifer Martinez. I'm a private investigator, and I've been hired to locate you regarding a matter involving your estranged husband, David Walsh." My blood ran cold. Had David hired someone to track me down? Was he planning some kind of legal action I hadn't anticipated? "Who hired you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Actually, Mrs. Walsh, I was hired by Rebecca Chen." The name hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca Chen, the woman my husband had been having an affair with, had hired a private investigator to find me. But why? What could she possibly want from me? "I don't understand," I said, gathering my laptop and papers as other coffee shop patrons turned to look at me. "What does Rebecca Chen want with me?" "She'd like to meet with you, Mrs. Walsh. She says she has information about your husband that you need to know, information that goes far beyond what you've already discovered." I walked outside into the Phoenix heat, my mind racing. What could Rebecca possibly tell me that I didn't already know? I'd seen their emails, understood the scope of their affair, documented David's financial betrayals. What more was there? "Mrs. Walsh, are you still there?" "I'm here," I said, leaning against my car. What kind of information? She wouldn't give me details over the phone, but she seemed quite urgent about it. She said to tell you that David isn't who you think he is, and that you're not his first victim. The word sent a chill through me despite the desert heat. Not his first victim? What did that mean? Had David been married before? Had he done this to other women? Where does she want to meet? I heard myself asking, though part of me screamed that this was a terrible idea. She's actually here in Phoenix. She flew in yesterday. She's staying at the Phoenician Resort and would like to meet you this evening if possible. Rebecca Chen was in Phoenix. The woman who had destroyed my marriage was less than 20 miles away from where I stood, asking to meet with me. Every rational instinct told me to refuse, to hang up the phone and pretend this conversation had never happened. But a stronger instinct, the same one that had driven me to investigate David's laptop that Tuesday morning, demanded answers. 7 o'clock, I said. The lobby bar at the Phoenician. And Ms. Martinez? I want you there too. If this is some kind of setup, I want a witness. 3 hours later, I sat in the elegant lobby bar of the Phoenician Resort, nursing a glass of wine and trying to calm my nerves. I'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple black dress that made me feel confident and professional. I'd also called Margaret to tell her where I was going, just in case something went wrong. Are you sure about this? Margaret had asked. What if it's some kind of trap? What if David put her up to this? Then I'll find out, I'd replied. But Jennifer, Martinez seemed legitimate, and I need to know what Rebecca thinks I should know about David. At exactly 7 o'clock, Jennifer Martinez approached my table. She was a small, competent-looking woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. Mrs. Walsh? I'm Jennifer. Rebecca should be here any moment. I'd been expecting someone young and beautiful, someone who could explain David's midlife crisis and justify his betrayal. The woman who walked into the bar 5 minutes later was indeed young, probably in her late 20s, but she looked exhausted and frightened rather than seductive. Rebecca Chen was petite with long dark hair and the kind of delicate features that photographs beautifully, but her eyes were red-rimmed, and she moved with the careful precision of someone trying to hold herself together. Mrs. Walsh, she said, extending a trembling hand. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be incredibly difficult. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all I saw was genuine distress. Whatever Rebecca wanted to tell me, she was as nervous about this meeting as I was. Please sit down, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. You said you had information about my husband. Rebecca sat down and immediately began twisting her hands in her lap. First, I need you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. When I met David 18 months ago, I thought he was divorced. He told me his marriage had ended years ago, but that he was still living in the house temporarily for financial reasons. I felt a familiar surge of anger at David's lies, but I kept my expression neutral. Go on. He was so charming, so attentive. He seemed genuinely interested in my business ideas, offered to help me develop marketing strategies. The consulting fees he paid were real at first. I was actually doing work for him, creating social media campaigns and website content. Jennifer Martinez was taking notes, documenting everything Rebecca said. I appreciated her professional presence. It made this surreal conversation feel more manageable. When did you find out he was still married? I asked. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. 6 months ago. I found a credit card statement in his jacket with your name on it as a joint account holder. When I confronted him, he said you were separated, but still sharing some finances. He promised he was going to file for divorce as soon as he could afford the legal fees. The lies kept multiplying. Even within his affair, David had been deceiving Rebecca, manipulating her emotions, just as he'd manipulated mine. But that's not why I'm here, Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger. Mrs. Walsh, 3 days ago I discovered something that made me realize David has been lying to both of us about much more than his marital status. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on the table between us. I found these documents in David's apartment, the one he rented for our meetings. I think you need to see them. I opened the folder with trembling hands, unsure what new betrayal I was about to discover. The first document was a marriage certificate dated 15 years ago. David Walsh and Linda Morrison, married in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was married before, I said, looking up at Rebecca in confusion, but he told me I was his first wife. He said he'd never been married before he met me. Keep reading, Rebecca said quietly. The next document was a divorce decree, dated 8 years ago. The divorce papers revealed that Linda Morrison had filed for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences and financial abuse. She'd been awarded half of their marital assets and ongoing alimony payments. Financial abuse, I said, the words barely a whisper. She accused him of financial abuse. There's more, Rebecca said, her voice heavy with regret. The third document was a police report filed by Linda Morrison 3 months before she filed for divorce. She'd reported that money was disappearing from their joint accounts, that David was making unauthorized transfers, and lying about business expenses. She'd suspected he was having an affair and using their money to finance it. The pattern was identical to what David had done to me. The mysterious business expenses, the transfers to fake consulting accounts, the systematic theft of marital assets to fund a relationship with another woman. Mrs. Walsh, Rebecca said gently, I don't think you were David's second wife. I think you were his third. The bar seemed to spin around me as the implications sank in. David had done this before, possibly multiple times. The charming courtship, the gradual isolation from my career ambitions, the years of seemingly devoted marriage followed by the secret affair and financial betrayal. It wasn't a midlife crisis or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. How did you find these documents? I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I was looking for insurance papers after a minor car accident, Rebecca explained. David keeps important documents in a file cabinet in the apartment bedroom. When I opened it, these were sitting right on top, almost like he wanted them to be found. Jennifer Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Walsh, I've been investigating David Walsh for the past 2 weeks at Rebecca's request. There are at least 2 other women I've identified who fit a similar pattern. Sarah Kim in Portland, divorced from David 6 years ago under circumstances nearly identical to yours. And Maria Santos in Denver, who ended a 2-year relationship with David 3 years ago after discovering he was married. Maria wasn't married to him? I asked. No, but she was engaged. She'd given him access to her business accounts to help with what he claimed were temporary cash flow problems. When she discovered he was still married to you, she broke off the engagement. By then, he transferred over $40,000 from her accounts to cover what he said were marketing expenses for her interior design business. The full scope of David's deception was staggering. He wasn't just an unfaithful husband. He was a serial predator who targeted women, gained their trust, and systematically stole from them. I'd been married to a criminal for 30 years without realizing it. Why are you telling me this? I asked Rebecca. Why risk exposing yourself? You were part of his latest scheme. Rebecca's tears started flowing again. Because I was falling in love with him, Mrs. Walsh. I thought we had a future together. But when I found these documents, I realized I was just another victim in his pattern. He wasn't planning to leave you for me. He was planning to leave both of us for someone new once he'd taken everything he could get. She reached into her purse again and pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. These are texts he sent me last week, while he was still planning his Portland trip with me. She showed me the screen, and I saw messages between David and someone named Ashley. The same affectionate tone, the same promises, the same excitement about secret meetings. David was already cultivating his next victim while maintaining relationships with both Rebecca and me. Ashley Brennan, Jennifer Martinez said, consulting her notes. 26 years old, recently inherited a substantial trust fund from her grandmother. David met her at a charity event 3 weeks ago and has been presenting himself as a successful marketing consultant looking for investment opportunities. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, that I felt oddly detached from it. This wasn't about our marriage failing or David falling out of love with me. This was about a man who viewed women as resources to be exploited, who had built his entire adult life around defrauding the people who trusted him most. What do you want from me? I asked Rebecca. I want to stop him, she said fiercely. I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else. And I think together, we can build a case that will put him in prison where he belongs." Quote. Jennifer Martinez nodded. "I've already been in contact with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. They're very interested in pursuing charges, but they worried about you for years. The way David always dismissed your accomplishments, how he kept you so isolated from meaningful work, the way he controlled every aspect of your social life. I thought he was just a controlling husband, but this is so much worse." "I feel like such an idiot," I said, tears finally starting to flow. How did I not see this? How did I live with a criminal for 30 years without realizing what he was? "Because he was good at it," Margaret said firmly. "Because manipulation and deception were his professional skills. You're not stupid, Catherine. You're just a good person who couldn't imagine the level of calculated evil you were dealing with." We stayed up until nearly midnight, calling Agent Reeves and setting up an appointment for the following day. Margaret insisted on coming with me, saying she wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. That night, lying in Margaret's guest room, I thought about the choice I was facing. I could provide my testimony and documentation to the FBI, helping to build a case that would likely put David in prison for the rest of his life. Or I could walk away, focus on building my new life, and let someone else deal with stopping David's crimes. The easy choice was to walk away. I'd already escaped David's trap, already secured my financial independence, already started the process of rebuilding my identity. Getting involved in a federal prosecution would mean months of legal proceedings, media attention, and reliving the most painful period of my life in public. But I kept thinking about Ashley Brennan, 26 years old with a trust fund, and probably no idea that she was being targeted by a professional predator. I thought about the women who might come after Ashley, the lives David would destroy if he was allowed to continue his pattern. I thought about Linda Morrison, who had tried to warn people about David's financial abuse 8 years ago, and how much pain she could have been spared if someone had listened. I thought about Sarah Kim and Maria Santos, who had suffered in isolation because they didn't know they were part of a larger pattern. By morning, my decision was clear. Agent Reeves was a tall, serious woman in her 40s who treated our meeting with the gravity it deserved. Her office in the federal building downtown was lined with law books and case files, and she took detailed notes as I walked through 30 years of marriage to David Walsh. "Mrs. Walsh," she said when I finished my account, "what you're describing fits perfectly with the information we've received from Mr. Walsh's other victims. The pattern is consistent across multiple relationships: initial charm and attention, gradual financial integration, systematic theft disguised as business expenses, and eventual abandonment when the victim becomes suspicious or the financial resources are exhausted." "How many victims are there?" I asked. "That we know of? 5, including yourself. But I suspect there are more. Men like David Walsh don't usually start with elaborate long-term schemes. They typically begin with smaller frauds and work their way up to more complex operations." Margaret leaned forward. "What kind of sentence would David be looking at if he's convicted?" "Multiple counts of federal fraud could result in 20 to 30 years in prison," Agent Reeves said. "Possibly more if we can prove he's been doing this for longer than we currently have evidence for." The magnitude of David's potential punishment was sobering. 30 years in prison would essentially be a life sentence for a man in his 50s. But then I thought about the 30 years he'd stolen from me, the decades of lies and manipulation that had shaped my entire adult life. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Agent Reeves smiled for the first time since our meeting began. "Everything you can give us, Mrs. Walsh. Bank statements, credit card records, emails, financial documents, testimony about David's behavior patterns. We want to build a case so comprehensive that David Walsh never has the opportunity to victimize another woman." The next 6 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I worked with federal agents to document every aspect of my financial relationship with David, going back through decades of bank statements and tax returns to identify suspicious transactions. I provided testimony about David's behavior patterns, his methods of manipulation, and the gradual way he'd isolated me from independent financial resources. The investigation expanded rapidly as more victims came forward. Jennifer Martinez had been right about David's pattern extending beyond the women she'd already identified. 3 more former girlfriends contacted the FBI after news of the investigation began circulating through law enforcement networks. Each new victim's story was depressingly similar. David would target successful women, usually in their 30s or 40s, who had either substantial savings or promising careers. He'd present himself as a successful businessman looking for partnership opportunities, both personal and professional. Once he'd gained their trust and access to their finances, he'd systematically drain their resources while maintaining the facade of a loving relationship. The most heartbreaking case was Jennifer Stevens, a nurse from Seattle who had met David 3 years ago through an online dating site. She'd been saving money to buy a house, working extra shifts, and living frugally to build her down payment fund. David had convinced her to invest her savings in what he claimed was a real estate development project. When the relationship ended 6 months later, Jennifer discovered that her $45,000 had been transferred to accounts she couldn't trace. "I kept thinking it was my fault," Jennifer told me during one of our phone conversations. "Like I'd been stupid to trust him, naive to think someone like David could really love someone like me." Her words echoed my own feelings so precisely that I felt like I was looking into a mirror. David's greatest skill wasn't stealing money. It was making his victims blame themselves for his crimes. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of David's theft. Over the past 15 years, he'd stolen nearly $800,000 from the women he'd been involved with. Some of it had been spent on his lavish lifestyle, but much of it had been funneled into offshore accounts that federal investigators were still trying to trace. "Your husband is a very sophisticated criminal," Agent Reeves told me during one of our meetings. "He's been planning for the possibility of prosecution for years, setting up financial structures that would allow him to disappear with substantial assets if his schemes were discovered." "Is that why he was talking about moving overseas?" I asked. "Partly. But we also think he was running out of viable targets in the United States. Women are becoming more aware of financial fraud, more likely to verify business claims and check backgrounds. David was probably planning to start over in a country where his reputation wouldn't precede him." The thought of David continuing his crimes internationally, targeting women who would have even less legal recourse, strengthened my resolve to see the prosecution through to completion. Meanwhile, I was building my new life in Phoenix with an energy and enthusiasm I hadn't felt in decades. The graphic design business I'd started was growing rapidly, fueled by referrals from satisfied clients and my own renewed creativity. For the first time in years, I was working on projects that genuinely excited me, using skills that had been dormant during my years as David's supportive wife. I'd also found my own apartment, a bright 2-bedroom unit with mountain views and a workspace where I could spread out my design materials. Margaret had helped me furnish it with pieces that reflected my personal taste rather than David's preferences, and I'd discovered that my decorating style was much more colorful and eclectic than the neutral elegance David had favored. "You look 10 years younger," Margaret said one evening as we sat on my new patio, watching the sunset over the Phoenix mountains. "I haven't seen you this happy since before you married David." She was right. Cooperation from David's victims. Sarah Kim and Maria Santos have both agreed to provide testimony and financial documentation. If you and Rebecca are willing to do the same, we can present a case that shows a clear pattern of fraud. I stared at the documents spread across our table, evidence of crimes that spanned more than a decade. David hadn't just betrayed me, he'd made a career out of betraying women who loved him. The modest lifestyle he'd encouraged, the delays in having children, the insistence that I scale back my career ambitions. It had all been designed to make me financially dependent and less likely to discover his schemes. "He's planning to disappear," Rebecca said quietly. "Yesterday I overheard a phone call where he was talking about liquidating assets and moving overseas. He thinks you took half of his money when you left, but he doesn't realize that you've also disrupted his timeline for finding a new victim." "What do you mean?" "He was planning to divorce you after he'd secured Ashley's trust fund," Jennifer explained, "but your sudden departure forced him to accelerate his plans." Now he's scrambling to extract what he can from his current schemes before law enforcement catches up with him. The thought of David starting over in another country, finding new victims who wouldn't have access to warnings about his past, was unbearable. I thought about Ashley Brennan, 26 years old and wealthy enough to be an attractive target. Did she have family who would miss her money? Friends who would notice if she started acting differently? What would I need to do? I asked. Jennifer pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. Agent Patricia Reeves, FBI Financial Crimes Division. She's expecting your call. We need documentation of all financial transactions between you and David. Copies of any communications that show his deceptive practices, and your testimony about his pattern of behavior. And what happens to David? If we can prove a pattern of interstate fraud, he's looking at serious federal charges, multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft. We're talking about potential prison time measured in decades, not years. I picked up Agent Reeves' business card, running my thumb over the embossed FBI seal. 3 weeks ago, I'd thought my biggest problem was rebuilding my life after a painful divorce. Now I was being asked to help put my ex-husband in federal prison. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Rebecca said. But Mrs. Walsh, please don't take too long. Every day we wait is another day he has to cover his tracks or find new victims. After Rebecca and Jennifer left, I sat alone in the bar for another hour, nursing a second glass of wine and trying to process everything I'd learned. The David I'd been married to was a complete fiction, a carefully constructed persona designed to hide the reality of a man who saw marriage as a long-term con game. I thought about all the times I'd felt guilty for suspecting something was wrong, all the moments when I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid or ungrateful. My instincts had been right from the beginning, but David's manipulation had been so skillful that I doubted my own perceptions rather than trust what I was seeing. The drive back to Margaret's house was a blur of desert highway and swirling thoughts. How many red flags had I missed over the years? How many other women had David been involved with during our marriage? How much money had he stolen from me before I discovered the truth? Margaret was waiting for me when I walked through her front door, concern written across her face. How did it go? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, I said, sinking into her living room couch. I've seen the devil, and I was married to him for 30 years. I told Margaret everything Rebecca had revealed, showing her the documents Jennifer had photographed with her phone. Margaret's expression grew darker with each detail, her anger building as the scope of David's crimes became clear. This explains so much, she said when I finished. Catherine, despite the stress of the federal investigation, despite the painful process of reliving 30 years of deception, I felt more alive and authentic than I had in decades. The woman who had been suffocated by David's manipulation was finally free to breathe. The arrest came on a Thursday morning in November. Agent Reeves called me at 7 a.m. to let me know that David had been taken into custody at his apartment, the same apartment where Rebecca had discovered the evidence of his previous marriages. He didn't resist, she told me. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. I think he knew this day was coming. David's arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday, and Agent Reeves asked if I wanted to attend. Part of me was curious to see David one last time, to look into the eyes of the man who had stolen 30 years of my life and understand what kind of person could commit such elaborate deceptions. But a larger part of me wanted to leave David Walsh in the past where he belonged. I don't need to see him again, I told Agent Reeves. I've already seen everything I need to see. The local news picked up the story, and for several days I fielded calls from reporters wanting to interview the brave woman who exposed a serial marriage fraudster. I declined all interviews, not because I was ashamed of my role in David's prosecution, but because I didn't want my new life to be defined by my old one. Rebecca Chen did give interviews, and I watched her on the evening news with admiration. She spoke eloquently about the importance of women trusting their instincts, of recognizing manipulation tactics, and of supporting each other when facing betrayal. David Walsh was a professional predator, she said during one interview. He studied his victims, learned their vulnerabilities, and exploited their capacity for love and trust. But he made one crucial mistake. He underestimated the strength of the women he targeted. When we worked together instead of competing with each other, when we shared information instead of hiding in shame, we were able to stop him. 2 weeks after David's arrest, I received a letter from Linda Morrison, his first wife. She'd seen news coverage of the case and wanted to thank me for having the courage to pursue prosecution. "I tried to warn people about David 8 years ago," she wrote, "but I felt like no one took me seriously. I was just another bitter ex-wife making accusations I couldn't prove." Seeing all of his victims come together, seeing the pattern finally exposed, it validates everything I went through. Thank you for not letting him get away with it. Linda's letter made me realize that my decision to cooperate with the FBI wasn't just about stopping David's future crimes. It was about validating the experiences of every woman he'd victimized, about proving that our pain and betrayal mattered, that the years he'd stolen from us had value. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for December, and I spent the weeks leading up to it preparing my testimony with federal prosecutors. They walked me through every aspect of David's manipulation tactics, helping me understand how his behavior fit into established patterns of financial and emotional abuse. "Mrs. Walsh," the lead prosecutor said during one of our preparation sessions, "your case is particularly important because it shows the long-term psychological effects of this kind of systematic deception. You were married to David Walsh for 30 years, longer than any of his other relationships. Your testimony will help the jury understand that this wasn't just theft, it was a form of psychological torture." I'd never thought of my marriage in those terms before, but the description felt accurate. David hadn't just stolen money from me, he'd stolen my confidence, my sense of reality, my ability to trust my own perceptions. The damage he'd done went far beyond financial fraud. As December approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating the hearing. I was nervous about testifying, about having my private life examined in public, about facing David's defense attorney's attempts to discredit my account, but I was also eager to have my day in court, to speak the truth about what David had done not just to me, but to all of his victims. The weekend before the hearing, Margaret and I drove up to Sedona for a quiet retreat. We hiked among the red rocks, meditated in the desert silence, and talked about how much my life had changed since that Tuesday morning when I discovered David's emails. "Do you ever regret leaving the way you did?" Margaret asked as we watched the sunset from a scenic overlook. I considered the question carefully. My decision to disappear while David was in Portland with Rebecca had been impulsive, driven by anger and betrayal. I could have confronted him directly, demanded explanations, tried to save our marriage through counseling or negotiation. Some people might consider my approach cowardly or vindictive. "No," I said finally. If I'd confronted David directly, he would have found a way to manipulate the situation. He would have made promises he had no intention of keeping, convinced me that I was overreacting, made me question my own perceptions the way he had for years. Leaving the way I did forced him to deal with consequences instead of excuses. Margaret smiled. "You saved yourself, Catherine. And in doing that, you probably saved a lot of other women too." On Sunday night, I sat in my Phoenix apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built in just 4 months, and wrote in the journal I'd been keeping since leaving David. I wrote about the fear and excitement of starting over at 53, about the strange process of discovering who I was outside of marriage, about the unexpected strength I'd found in the darkest period of my life. "Tomorrow I'll testify against the man I was married to for 30 years, I wrote. "I'll tell a courtroom full of strangers about the most painful betrayal of my life, but I'm not doing it as David Walsh's victim. I'm doing it as Catherine Walsh, a woman who refused to let a criminal define her future." I closed the journal and looked around my apartment, at the colorful artwork I'd chosen, the plants I was learning to nurture, the workspace where I created designs that reflected my own vision rather than someone else's requirements. This was my life now, built on honesty instead of lies, independence instead of manipulation, hope instead of fear. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, whatever David's attorney said about me or my marriage, whatever verdict the jury eventually reached, I had already won the most important victory. I had reclaimed myself. The alarm clock buzzed at 6 in the morning, and I got up to face the day that would finally close the chapter on my marriage to David Walsh. But this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of everything I was meant to become. The federal courthouse in Phoenix was an imposing building of glass and steel that reflected the desert morning sun like a mirror. I stood on the steps at 8:30, wearing a navy blue suit I'd purchased specifically for this day, feeling both nervous and determined. Margaret squeezed my hand as we walked through the security checkpoint, and I drew strength from her steady presence beside me. "You've got this," she whispered as we entered the courtroom. "Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from television shows, but more intimidating in its stark formality. Federal prosecutors sat at one table, their files and laptops arranged with military precision. David's defense team occupied the other table, two expensive-looking attorneys in perfectly tailored suits who looked like they specialized in making criminals appear sympathetic. And then there was David himself. I hadn't seen my ex-husband since that morning in October when he'd kissed my cheek and left for his romantic weekend with Rebecca. 4 months in federal custody had changed him dramatically. His hair was grayer, his face thinner, and he wore an orange jumpsuit that made him look older and smaller than the confident businessman I'd been married to. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection, just a distant recognition of someone who had once been important in my life, but was now irrelevant to my future. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Linda Morrison despite the shared surname, called the court to order with a brisk authority that immediately commanded attention. She was a woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the proceedings. "This is a preliminary hearing in the case of United States versus David Walsh," she announced. "The defendant is charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines. We're here today to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial." The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, stood to present the government's case. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, but he spoke with the confidence of someone who'd prosecuted many similar cases. "Your Honor," he began, "the evidence will show that David Walsh operated a sophisticated scheme to defraud multiple women over a period of more than 15 years. The defendant used romantic relationships as a cover for systematic financial theft, targeting successful women with substantial assets and stealing nearly $800,000 through false pretenses and identity manipulation." Chen outlined the prosecution's case methodically, describing how David had created false business entities to justify money transfers, forged documents to support his lies, and used multiple identities to avoid detection by his victims. The scope of the evidence was staggering, filling dozens of boxes and hundreds of digital files. "The government will present testimony from 5 victims," Chen continued, "as well as financial experts, forensic accountants, and federal investigators who have traced the defendant's criminal activities across 7 states and multiple jurisdictions." David's lead attorney, Harrison Mills, was everything I'd expected from his reputation as one of Phoenix's most expensive criminal defense lawyers. He was tall, silver-haired, and spoke with the kind of polished authority that probably intimidated most witnesses. But when he stood to present David's defense, his arguments sounded hollow even to my untrained ear. "Your Honor," Mills said, "my client acknowledges that his personal relationships were complicated and that some financial arrangements ended badly. But the government is attempting to criminalize what were essentially civil disputes between consenting adults. David Walsh is not a criminal mastermind. He's a man whose business ventures failed and whose personal life became entangled with his professional obligations." Mills argued that David's relationships with his alleged victims were genuine, that the money transfers were legitimate business investments or personal loans, and that the women involved were trying to punish him for romantic disappointments by turning civil matters into criminal charges. "These women," Mills said, gesturing toward the witness section where Rebecca, Sarah, Maria, and Jennifer sat, "are bitter about failed relationships and seeking revenge through the criminal justice system. My client made poor personal choices, but poor choices are not crimes." I felt a surge of anger at Mills's characterization of David's victims as vindictive ex-girlfriends, but I also recognized it as a predictable defense strategy. David's attorneys were going to try to put the victims on trial instead of their client, to make us appear unstable, greedy, or vengeful. The prosecution began presenting evidence immediately after the opening statements. Federal Agent Patricia Reeves took the stand first, walking the court through the investigation that had led to David's arrest. She presented timelines, financial records, and digital evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had built hundreds of similar cases. Agent Reeves, Chen asked, "In your professional opinion, does the evidence support a finding that David Walsh engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior?" "Absolutely," Reeves replied. "The defendant's methods were consistent across multiple victims and multiple jurisdictions. He used the same false business entities, the same romantic manipulation tactics, and the same financial theft strategies. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a systematic operation designed to exploit vulnerable women." Mills cross-examined Reeves aggressively, trying to poke holes in the investigation and suggest that federal agents had rushed to judgment based on circumstantial evidence. But Reeves had clearly prepared for this attack, responding to each question with calm professionalism and referring repeatedly to specific pieces of documented evidence. The financial expert testified next, a forensic accountant named Dr. Rebecca Lawrence, who had spent weeks analyzing David's banking records and financial transactions. Her testimony was dense with technical details, but her conclusions were devastating for David's defense. "Dr. Lawrence," Chen asked, "what did your analysis reveal about the defendant's financial activities?" "The defendant operated at least 12 different business entities over the past 15 years, Dr. Lawrence replied, consulting her notes. "Most of these entities existed only on paper, with no legitimate business activities or revenue sources. However, they received substantial transfers from accounts controlled by women the defendant was romantically involved with." Dr. Lawrence explained how David had used these shell companies to disguise theft as business transactions, creating invoices for services that were never provided and contracts for investments that never existed. The complexity of his financial manipulations suggested years of planning and expertise in avoiding detection. "In your professional opinion," Chen continued, "could these financial arrangements have been legitimate business transactions?" "No," Dr. Lawrence said firmly. "The pattern is completely inconsistent with legitimate business activities. The defendant received money but provided no verifiable services or investment opportunities. The financial flows were designed to obscure theft, not to facilitate genuine business relationships." Mills's cross-examination of Dr. Lawrence was less successful than his questioning of Agent Reeves. The financial evidence was too detailed and too damning to explain away as misunderstandings or failed investments. Mills tried to suggest that the shell companies were legitimate business ventures that had simply been unsuccessful. But Dr. Lawrence's analysis had already demonstrated that no genuine business activities had ever taken place. By the end of the first day, the prosecution had established a clear pattern of sophisticated financial fraud. But the real test would come when David's victims took the stand to describe how his crimes had affected their lives. Rebecca Chen was the first victim to testify, and I watched her walk to the witness stand with a mixture of admiration and sympathy. 4 months ago, she'd been complicit in destroying my marriage, but her willingness to expose David's crimes had taken tremendous courage. "Ms. Chen," Chen asked, "how did you first meet the defendant?" "At a networking event for small business owners in Phoenix," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the obvious stress of testifying. "David introduced himself as a marketing consultant who specialized in helping technology startups develop their brands." Rebecca described how David had pursued her professionally and personally, offering business advice while gradually becoming more romantic in his approach. She explained how he'd convinced her that he was divorced, how he'd encouraged her to trust him with increasing amounts of money for marketing services, and how she'd discovered the truth about his marriage and his pattern of deception. "Ms. Chen," Chen asked, "did you ever receive the marketing services you paid for?" "Some of them," Rebecca admitted. "David did create some social media content and website materials in the beginning. But as our relationship progressed, the work became less professional and more personal. I was paying for business consulting, but I was really paying to support his lifestyle." Mills's cross-examination of Rebecca was particularly aggressive, clearly designed to portray her as a willing participant in an affair who was now seeking revenge against David for not leaving his wife as promised. "Ms. Chen," Mills asked, "isn't it true that you knew David Walsh was married when you began your romantic relationship with him?" "No," Rebecca replied firmly. "He told me he was divorced. I had no reason to doubt him." But you didn't verify his marital status? You didn't check public records or ask to see divorce papers? Why would I? Rebecca asked, her voice rising slightly. When someone you're romantically involved with tells you they're divorced, you don't typically demand to see legal documentation. Mills continued this line of questioning for nearly an hour, trying to establish that Rebecca had been a willing participant in David's deception rather than a victim of it. But Rebecca's answers remained consistent, and her obvious distress at reliving the experience seemed to resonate with Judge Morrison. Sarah Kim testified next, describing her marriage to David and the financial abuse she'd suffered during their relationship. Sarah was composed and articulate, presenting a timeline of David's manipulation that was remarkably similar to my own experience. Mrs. Kim, Chen asked, did the defendant ever discuss his previous marriages with you? He told me he'd been married once before, briefly, to someone who couldn't handle his business travel schedule, Sarah replied. He made it sound like an amicable divorce with no ongoing complications. Sarah's testimony revealed that David had stolen nearly $150,000 from their joint accounts during their marriage, using the same shell company tactics Dr. Lawrence had described. When Sarah had become suspicious and demanded explanations, David had accused her of being paranoid and controlling. He made me feel like I was crazy for questioning him, Sarah said, tears beginning to flow. He'd get angry when I asked about money, tell me I didn't understand business, make me feel guilty for not trusting him. I started doubting my own perceptions. Mills's cross-examination of Sarah focused on the fact that she'd remained married to David for 3 years after discovering the financial irregularities, suggesting that she couldn't have been too concerned about his behavior if she'd stayed in the relationship. Mrs. Kim, Mills asked, if you truly believed your husband was stealing from you, why didn't you leave immediately? Because I loved him, Sarah replied simply. Because he convinced me that I was wrong, that the problems were my fault, that we could work things out if I just trusted him more. Her answer captured something essential about David's method of operation. He didn't just steal money, he stole his victims' confidence in their own judgment, making them complicit in their own victimization through guilt and self-doubt. Maria Santos and Jennifer Stevens provided similar testimony, each describing how David had gained their trust, exploited their vulnerabilities, and stolen their money while maintaining the facade of a loving relationship. By the time they finished testifying, the pattern was undeniable. David Walsh was a professional predator who had made a career out of exploiting women who trusted him. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs, acutely aware that David was watching my every move. I'd prepared for this moment for weeks, but actually sitting in the witness chair and looking out at the courtroom filled with strangers felt surreal. Chen approached me with a gentle smile, clearly understanding that my testimony was crucial to establishing the long-term pattern of David's behavior. Mrs. Walsh, he began, how long were you married to the defendant? 30 years, I replied, my voice stronger than I'd expected. During those 30 years, did you have any reason to suspect that your husband was involved in criminal activities? I thought about all the warning signs I'd ignored, all the rationalizations I'd made, all the times my instincts had told me something was wrong, but I'd chosen to trust David instead of myself. Not criminal activities specifically, I said, but I knew something was wrong. I felt disconnected from him, felt like he was living a secret life I wasn't part of. I just didn't understand the scope of what he was hiding. Chen guided me through my marriage to David, focusing on the financial control he'd exercised, the way he'd discouraged my career ambitions, and the systematic isolation he'd created to make me financially dependent. I described the morning I'd discovered his emails with Rebecca, the investigation I'd conducted, and the decision I'd made to leave without confronting him directly. Mrs. Walsh, Chen asked, why didn't you confront your husband about the affair when you first discovered it? Because I knew he would lie, I said, looking directly at David for the first time since taking the stand. He'd been lying to me for 30 years about who he was and what he was doing. I didn't want to give him another opportunity to manipulate me. I testified about the financial evidence I'd gathered, the money David had stolen from our joint accounts, and the pattern of deception that had characterized our entire marriage. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as if speaking these truths aloud in a public forum was finally freeing me from the shame and self-doubt David had cultivated. Mills's cross-examination was more respectful than his questioning of the other victims, probably because attacking a woman who'd been married to David for 30 years would make him appear unsympathetic to the judge. But he still tried to portray me as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge through the criminal justice system. "Mrs. Walsh," Mills asked, "isn't it true that you left your marriage because you discovered your husband was having an affair, not because you believed he was committing crimes?" "I left because I discovered that my entire marriage was based on lies," I corrected. "The affair was just the tip of the iceberg. When I started investigating, I found evidence of systematic financial deception that had been going on for years. But you never reported these alleged crimes to law enforcement until after you'd already filed for divorce?" "I reported them when I became aware that David was part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior," I said. "When I learned that other women had been victimized in the same way I had." Mills continued pressing me about my motives for cooperating with the prosecution, clearly trying to establish that I was motivated by personal revenge rather than a desire for justice. But I'd prepared for these questions, and I answered them calmly and truthfully. "Mr. Mills," I said finally, "I didn't pursue this prosecution to hurt David. I pursued it to prevent him from hurting other women the way he hurt me and the other victims who've testified here." After I finished testifying, the prosecution called several character witnesses who described David's pattern of manipulation in non-romantic contexts. Former business associates testified about suspicious financial arrangements and broken promises. A forensic psychologist explained how David's behavior fit established patterns of psychopathic manipulation. The defense's case was much shorter and far less convincing. Mills called several character witnesses, who described David as a charming, generous man who'd simply made poor personal choices. A financial expert hired by the defense tried to argue that some of David's business arrangements could have been legitimate, but his testimony was undercut by the overwhelming evidence of fraud. David himself chose not to testify, probably because his attorneys knew that cross-examination would expose him to devastating questions about his pattern of deception. His silence spoke volumes about the weakness of his defense. The closing arguments took place on Friday afternoon. Chen methodically summarized the evidence against David, emphasizing the consistency of his criminal methods across multiple victims and multiple jurisdictions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen said, addressing Judge Morrison, "the evidence in this case is overwhelming. David Walsh operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to exploit women's trust and steal their money. He ruined lives, destroyed families, and showed no remorse for the pain he caused. The federal charges against him are not only warranted, they're essential to protecting other potential victims from his predatory behavior." Mills's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt and the possibility that David's relationships had been genuinely romantic, even if they'd ended badly. But his arguments sounded increasingly desperate as he tried to explain away the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented. "Your Honor," Mills said, "my client may have been a poor husband and an unsuccessful businessman, but poor judgment is not a federal crime. The government has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David Walsh intended to defraud anyone." Judge Morrison recessed the court for the weekend to consider the evidence and prepare her ruling. As I walked out of the federal courthouse that Friday evening, I felt emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. The evidence against David was overwhelming, and his defense had been weak and unconvincing. Margaret and I spent the weekend hiking in the desert, trying to decompress from the intensity of the week's proceedings. I found myself thinking not about the trial, but about the life I was building in Phoenix. The graphic design projects that excited me, the friendships I was developing with people who knew nothing about my dramatic past. Whatever the judge decides, I told Margaret as we watched the sunset from a mountain trail, I've already gotten what I needed from this experience. I've told the truth about what David did, and I've proven to myself that I'm strong enough to face anything. Monday morning brought the judge's ruling. The courtroom was packed with victims, family members, reporters, and legal observers who'd been following the case. Judge Morrison entered with the same brisk authority she'd displayed throughout the proceedings, but her expression was unreadable. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," she began, And I find that the government has established probable cause to believe that David Walsh committed multiple federal crimes. The evidence shows a clear pattern of sophisticated fraud designed to exploit romantic relationships for financial gain. Judge Morrison's ruling was comprehensive and devastating for David's defense. She found probable cause for all the charges against him and ordered him held without bail pending trial, citing him as a flight risk based on evidence of his offshore financial arrangements. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Morrison said, looking directly at David, "you have systematically betrayed the trust of women who loved you, stolen their money, and showed no remorse for the pain you've caused. The evidence suggests you were preparing to flee the country to avoid prosecution, which demonstrates both consciousness of guilt and contempt for the legal process." David's face remained impassive as the judge spoke, but I could see his attorneys exchanging worried glances. The judge's strong language suggested that David was likely to face the maximum possible sentence if convicted at trial. After the hearing ended, I found myself surrounded by the other victims in the courthouse hallway. Rebecca, Sarah, Maria, and Jennifer had become unlikely allies during the prosecution process, bonded by our shared experience of David's manipulation. "Thank you," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for having the courage to pursue this. I never thought I'd see David held accountable for what he did to me." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "When I first realized what David was, I felt so ashamed and alone. But seeing all of us together, seeing how strong we all are, it makes me feel proud instead of ashamed." Agent Reeves approached our group with a satisfied smile. "Ladies," she said, "I wanted you to know that David's attorneys have indicated he's likely to accept a plea bargain. Rather than go to trial, he's looking at 20 to 25 years in federal prison." The news hit me with unexpected force. 20 to 25 years meant that David would likely die in prison, that his life of crime and manipulation was finally over. I felt no satisfaction in his destruction, but I felt deep relief that he would never again have the opportunity to victimize another woman. As I drove home to my Phoenix apartment that evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been Catherine Walsh, the perfect suburban wife, living a life built on lies and manipulation. Now I was Catherine Walsh, successful businesswoman, federal witness, and survivor of one of the most sophisticated marriage frauds the FBI had ever prosecuted. The graphic design business I'd started was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. Word of mouth had brought me clients throughout Arizona, and I was considering expanding into other southwestern markets. The work energized me in ways I'd forgotten were possible, and I'd rediscovered creative abilities that had been dormant for decades. More importantly, I'd rediscovered myself. The woman who had been afraid to trust her own instincts, who had allowed David to diminish her accomplishments and control her choices, no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, and more authentic than I'd ever been during my marriage. 3 weeks after the hearing, David accepted a plea bargain that sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. He also agreed to pay restitution to his victims, though the amount was substantially less than what he'd stolen, since most of the money had disappeared into offshore accounts that couldn't be traced. I received a check for $73,000, about half of what David had stolen from me during our marriage. The money was helpful, but it was insignificant compared to the freedom I'd gained by escaping his manipulation. Agent Reeves called to inform me of David's sentencing and to thank me again for my cooperation with the prosecution. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, "I've been investigating financial crimes for 15 years, and I've never seen a case where the victims showed as much courage and determination as you and the other women did. David Walsh thought he could continue his pattern indefinitely, but you proved him wrong. Will this case help other women who might be in similar situations?" I asked. "Absolutely. The prosecution techniques we developed will be used in other cases, and the publicity has raised awareness about this type of sophisticated romance fraud. You've probably saved dozens of women from becoming victims." That evening, I sat on my patio watching the Phoenix skyline light up as darkness fell over the desert. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and for a moment I worried that it might be from David or one of his supporters. Instead, it was from a woman named Christine Rodriguez. "Mrs. Walsh," the message read, I saw the news coverage of your ex-husband's sentencing. I think I'm in a similar situation with a man I've been dating for 8 months. He's asked me to invest money in his business, but after reading about your case, I'm having second thoughts. Could we talk? I called Christine immediately and spent an hour on the phone with her, listening to a story that was heartbreakingly familiar. Her boyfriend had presented himself as a successful entrepreneur, had gradually gained access to her finances, and was now pressuring her to make a substantial investment in what sounded like another fake business entity. Trust your instincts, I told her. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone pressure you into financial decisions you're not comfortable with, no matter how much you care about them. Christine thanked me and promised to do more research before making any financial commitments. 2 days later, she called back to tell me she'd discovered that her boyfriend had lied about his background and was already married to someone else. You saved me from making a terrible mistake, she said. I can't thank you enough. Over the following months, I received similar calls from women across the country who had seen news coverage of David's case and recognized warning signs in their own relationships. I started referring them to resources for fraud victims and connecting them with law enforcement when appropriate. Agent Reeves eventually suggested that I consider speaking at conferences about financial fraud prevention. You have a unique perspective, she said. You lived with a sophisticated criminal for 30 years without realizing it. Your insights could help other women recognize the warning signs before they become victims. I agreed to speak at a conference for financial advisors in Las Vegas, expecting an audience of maybe 50 people. Instead, I found myself addressing more than 300 professionals who worked with fraud victims. My presentation about recognizing long-term financial manipulation received a standing ovation and led to invitations to speak at similar events across the country. Speaking publicly about my experience with David was initially terrifying, but it became increasingly empowering as I realized how many people benefited from hearing my story. I wasn't just sharing details about fraud prevention, I was demonstrating that it was possible to rebuild a meaningful life after devastating betrayal. A year after David's sentencing, Rebecca Chen and I met for coffee in Scottsdale. She'd relocated to Arizona to start fresh, and we'd maintained a friendship based on our shared experience of surviving David's manipulation. Do you ever regret the way everything happened? She asked as we sat on a cafe patio, watching tourists browse the local art galleries. I considered the question carefully. My marriage to David had been built on lies, but it had also shaped 30 years of my life. The woman I'd become during those years, even diminished by his manipulation, had possessed qualities I still valued: loyalty, determination, and the capacity for deep love. I regret that I wasted so much time on someone who didn't deserve it, I said finally. But I don't regret the person I became because of the experience. Going through that level of betrayal and coming out stronger taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise. Rebecca nodded. I feel the same way. I was devastated when I first realized what David was, but now I feel grateful that I learned about manipulation tactics when I was still young enough to rebuild completely. We talked about our new lives, our business ventures, and the relationships we were considering with men who actually deserved our trust. Both of us had become much more cautious about romance, but also more confident in our ability to recognize red flags and protect ourselves. 2 years after leaving David, I was featured in a magazine article about women who had successfully reinvented themselves after major life upheavals. The journalist who interviewed me was particularly interested in how I'd managed to start a successful business and rebuild my social life so quickly after such a traumatic experience. I think the key was realizing that I wasn't starting from zero, I told her. I had skills, experience, and inner strength that David's manipulation had hidden but never destroyed. Once I was free from his influence, those qualities could flourish again. The article generated hundreds of emails from women in similar situations, and I began corresponding regularly with divorce and fraud survivors who were struggling to rebuild their lives. Many of them became clients for my graphic design business, and several became genuine friends. Margaret often marveled at how dramatically my life had changed since that Tuesday morning when I'd discovered David's betrayal. You're not the same person who lived in that house in Millbrook Heights, she observed during one of our regular hiking trips. It's like you've become who you were always meant to be. She was right. The woman who had defined herself entirely through her relationship to David, Walsh had been replaced by someone more independent, more creative, and more genuinely happy than I'd ever been during my marriage. The process of losing everything I'd thought I wanted had led me to discover what I actually needed: autonomy, authentic relationships, and work that reflected my true interests and abilities. 3 years after David's sentencing, I received news that he had died in federal prison. A heart attack, apparently sudden and unexpected. Agent Reeves called to inform me, asking if I wanted any details about the circumstances. "No," I said without hesitation. "I don't need to know anything more about David Walsh." I felt no grief at David's death, but also no satisfaction. He'd simply become irrelevant to my life, a figure from my past who had no connection to the woman I'd become. His death was the final closure on a chapter that had already ended years earlier. That evening, I sat in my home office, surrounded by current design projects and plans for expanding my business into new markets. The life I'd built in Phoenix was everything I'd never known I wanted: challenging work that utilized my skills, genuine friendships based on mutual respect, and complete autonomy over my choices and priorities. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking at the names of women I'd met through speaking engagements and support networks. Christine Rodriguez had started her own consulting business after escaping her fraudulent boyfriend. Sarah Kim had remarried and was expecting her first child with a man who treasured her independence rather than trying to control it. Rebecca Chen had launched a successful app that helped small businesses manage their finances more effectively. All of us had survived David Walsh and men like him. All of us had rebuilt our lives stronger and more authentic than before. We'd turned our victimization into wisdom, our pain into purpose, and our isolation into a network of mutual support. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Probably another woman who'd read one of the articles about financial fraud and needed someone to listen to her story. "Hello?" I answered. "This is Catherine." "Mrs. Walsh," a young voice said. "My name is Amanda Foster. I think my fiancé might be trying to defraud me, and I need help figuring out what to do." I settled back in my chair, prepared to spend as long as necessary helping another woman escape the trap I'd lived in for 30 years. This was my purpose now: using my experience to protect other women from the David Walshes of the world, helping them recognize their own strength and value before it was too late. "Tell me what's been happening, Amanda," I said. "And remember, whatever he's done to you, it's not your fault. You're going to get through this." As Amanda began describing a pattern of manipulation that was depressingly familiar, I looked out my office window at the Phoenix skyline, glittering under the desert stars. Somewhere out there were other women like Amanda, other potential victims who needed to hear that they deserved better, that they had options, that they were strong enough to rebuild their lives on their own terms. David Walsh had spent his life destroying women's confidence and stealing their futures. I was spending mine giving both back to as many women as I could reach. It was, I realized, the most meaningful work I'd ever done. The conversation with Amanda lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end, she'd decided to consult with a financial advisor and a private investigator before making any more financial commitments to her fiancé. She thanked me repeatedly, but I was the one who felt grateful. Every woman I helped represented another victory over the damage David had tried to inflict on the world. After we hung up, I walked out to my patio and looked up at the clear Arizona sky. Tomorrow, I had 3 client meetings, a conference call about a potential speaking engagement, and dinner plans with a new friend I'd met through my hiking group. It was a full life, a real life, built on honesty and genuine connections rather than manipulation and lies. I thought about the note I'd left for David on our kitchen counter that October morning, the words I'd written about him being free to start fresh with Rebecca. I'd had no idea then that I was the one who would truly start fresh, that leaving him would be the beginning of the best chapter of my life, rather than the end of everything I'd valued. The woman who had signed that note, simply Catherine, had been reborn in the desert, stronger and more authentic than she'd ever been before. And the life she'd built from the ashes of her marriage was proof that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.